Mexican cartel tries landing smuggling plane at Texas border. Until K9 dogs intervene. The cold wind swept across the barren desert of Texas, stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the air under the faint glow of the moon. It was a night like any other at the Texas-Mexico border. Quiet, still, and untouched by the bustling life of the cities beyond. The border, with its arid landscape and remote stretches, was a place that seemed forgotten by most people. But for those who worked in its shadows, it was a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the horizon. As the clock struck midnight, a lone figure stood on the watchtower, scanning the horizon with weary eyes. Officer Sarah Collins had been with the U.S. Border Patrol for over 5 years. And she knew the border like the back of her hand. She had seen it all: drug smugglers, human traffickers, desperate families trying to cross, and the occasional vehicle speeding past without a care in the world. But tonight was different. There was an unusual stillness in the air, a tension that Sarah couldn't quite shake. From her vantage point, the sprawling desert seemed endless, with only the occasional flicker of lights from the small towns in the distance. But then, she saw it, a small, dim light blinking in the sky. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a distant star. But Sarah's trained eyes quickly recognized the shape of the light. It wasn't a star. It was a plane. A small aircraft, flying low and fast, heading directly toward the border. Her heart skipped a beat. Sarah immediately reached for her radio. "Control. This is Collins. I have a visual on an unknown aircraft heading toward the border. It's moving fast and appears to be descending. Requesting immediate backup." The radio crackled to life with the voice of her supervisor. "Copy that? Collins. We're on it. Do not engage until further instructions. Stay on it." She nodded, though she knew they were too far out to prevent the plane from crossing. The border was vast, and a small plane could easily slip through undetected, especially in the dead of night. But this wasn't just any plane. Sarah had a sinking feeling in her gut that this was more than just a simple flight. She had been with the Border Patrol long enough to know when something didn't feel right. As the plane drew closer, Sarah's suspicions were confirmed. The aircraft wasn't just passing over the border, it was on a direct course to land in a remote section of the desert. Her heart raced as she grabbed her binoculars and scanned the sky. The plane was a small, unmarked craft, clearly not built for commercial use. It had all the hallmarks of an illegal smuggling operation. Sarah's mind raced. She had seen this kind of thing before, smugglers using planes to move large amounts of contraband across the border, hoping to avoid detection by the more common patrol routes. The use of small aircraft was becoming increasingly popular among criminal organizations, and the risk was higher than ever. The Mexican cartels had been known to employ sophisticated methods of smuggling, and this plane was no different. "Where are you heading?" Sarah muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowing as the aircraft began to descend further, heading toward a small dirt airstrip near a cluster of abandoned buildings. This was an area rarely patrolled due to its isolation. A perfect spot for an illegal landing. Her mind raced as she processed the situation. She couldn't wait for backup. The plane was too close, and there was no time to waste. If it was a cartel shipment, there was no telling what kind of dangerous goods it might be carrying. Drugs? Weapons? Or worse, it could be anything. And she had to act fast. Sarah grabbed her weapon. A trusty Glock 19. and strapped it to her belt. She slid down the ladder of the watchtower with swift precision and moved toward her patrol car. The engine hummed to life as she slammed the door shut and sped off toward the landing site. The vehicle's headlights illuminated the dark desert, cutting through the night like a beacon of urgency. She could see the aircraft clearly now. It was just a few miles ahead. She had to warn the rest of the team. As she sped down the road, her mind raced. The Border Patrol wasn't the only law enforcement agency working in the area. The DEA, local sheriff's deputies, and even the military had occasionally worked together in the past to take down cartel operations. But tonight, it was all up to her. Suddenly, the plane banked hard, its engines roaring as it made its final approach. It was descending at an alarming rate, and Sarah knew the pilot was preparing for a rough landing. This wasn't going to be a clean operation, whatever was happening. It was happening now. Her thoughts were interrupted as her radio crackled again. "Collins. We've got eyes on the plane. Get in position and wait for backup. Do not engage alone." Sarah's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She knew her orders, but she couldn't afford to wait. By the time backup arrived, it might be too late. The lights of the plane flickered and disappeared as it dipped behind a ridge. Sarah slammed the brakes and swerved, skidding across the dirt road toward the spot where the plane had last been visible. She had only a few moments before it touched down. She parked her vehicle behind a small hill to stay out of sight. Just as the aircraft's wheels hit the dirt runway, the plane bounced once, twice, and then finally came to a stop. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the vehicle, crouching low. Her eyes never left the aircraft as she moved swiftly through the brush. She needed to know what was on that plane, and she needed to know now. The sound of the engine sputtered to silence, and the desert was still once more. A few moments passed before the door of the plane creaked open, and two figures stepped out. Cloaked in the shadows, Sarah could barely make out their silhouettes in the dim light. But she knew they weren't just ordinary passengers. These were men involved in something far darker. They didn't look like they were here to unload cargo, they looked like they were here to protect it. The wind howled through the desert, carrying with it the scent of something more dangerous than the dust and sand. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to turn back, to wait for backup. But she couldn't. Not this time? The cartels had gotten smarter. And if she didn't act now, they would disappear into the night without a trace. Her fingers brushed against the radio on her vest, ready to send a warning. But then something stopped her. The faintest sound reached her ears, the unmistakable noise of approaching vehicles. She wasn't alone anymore. The cavalry had arrived. But as Sarah ducked behind a large boulder, a chilling realization washed over her. The backup wasn't just coming from the Border Patrol. Something else was at play here, something much bigger, and far more dangerous. The game was about to change, and Sarah knew she was at the heart of it all. As Sarah crouched behind the boulder, her heartbeat racing in her chest, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. It wasn't just the rumble of Border Patrol trucks, there were others too. Her eyes narrowed as she listened carefully, trying to make sense of the situation. These were no ordinary law enforcement vehicles. The engines sounded powerful, heavy, military? Perhaps. The tension in the air was palpable, each passing second heightening her sense of urgency. She needed to move. She needed to figure out what was happening and fast. The figures who had exited the plane had vanished behind the old, rusted hangar, the faintest trace of movement betraying their location. Sarah's instincts told her to stay low. But she also knew that if she didn't act quickly, this could turn into a disaster. She reached for her radio, whispering into it, "Control. This is Collins. I've spotted 2 suspects at the crash site. But something's off. I need more information, now?" There was a long pause. The static crackling in her ear before her supervisor's voice finally came through. "Sarah. We're sending in backup. But something's up. Intel suggests this operation involves more than just the usual cartel run. We've got a larger scope here. Possibly military-grade weaponry involved." "Understood," Sarah muttered, her grip tightening on her weapon. She looked around, trying to assess the situation. The figures were still behind the hangar. But the sound of approaching engines told her they were not alone anymore. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Suddenly, a bark pierced the air. Sharp and authoritative. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound. "Rocky," she whispered, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Thank God. Her team had arrived, and with them, Rocky, the German shepherd who was not just Sarah's partner in the field but also one of the most talented and trusted K9s in the Border Patrol. Rocky was known for his keen sense of smell and impeccable instincts. More importantly, he had saved Sarah's life on more than one occasion. As the vehicles came to a halt behind Sarah's patrol car, she could see the familiar silhouette of Sergeant Harris, her commanding officer, stepping out. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a serious expression that never seemed to fade. His eyes met hers, and without a word, he signaled for his team to spread out. "Rocky. Heel," Sergeant Harris commanded. The dog, a picture of focus, obeyed immediately. Walking to his handler's side with a sense of purpose, Sarah exhaled slowly, feeling the tension ease from her shoulders. She knew that with Rocky and the team now on site, things were about to get serious. But there was something else on her mind. She glanced at the shadowy figures moving behind the hangar and then turned back to Harris. "I don't like this. Those men aren't just smuggling. This is bigger. I've got a bad feeling about this." Harris nodded. "You're right to be concerned. But we've got backup now. Let's make sure we take them down before they can disappear. Keep it tight. Keep it clean." With one final glance at the hangar, Sarah followed Harris as he led the team toward their position. The rest of the K9 unit had already spread out, each member with their dog, moving with practiced precision. Sarah felt a surge of respect for the K9s. They weren't just animals, they were soldiers. Their noses could detect the faintest traces of drugs, explosives, or human scent. No one, not even the most experienced smugglers, could escape their noses. Sarah's eyes tracked Rocky as he began to sniff the ground near the entrance to the hangar. His nose twitched, and his ears pricked up, signaling that he'd picked up a scent. Sarah and Harris exchanged a quick glance before Harris nodded. "Let's move." They advanced in silence, using the natural cover of the landscape to stay hidden. The moonlight cast long shadows, but it was enough to see the hangar and the figures now moving toward the back of the building. The sound of boots crunching on the gravel was drowned out by the low growls of the K9s, who were locked onto the scents they'd found. As they approached the building, Sarah's mind raced with the possibilities. What were these men carrying? Why had they chosen such a remote, vulnerable spot for their operation? And most importantly, who else was involved? This wasn't a simple smuggling job, she could feel it in her gut. This was part of something much larger. Something darker. Suddenly, a loud bark broke the silence. Rocky had found something. The team froze, ready to spring into action. But before anyone could move, Sarah heard a voice from the other side of the hangar. "Keep it down, or we're dead." It was a low, urgent whisper, but Sarah recognized it immediately. A voice, rough and full of tension. She knew that voice, it belonged to one of the cartel's notorious lieutenants. Sarah had encountered him once before during a raid. His name was Javier Ortega, and he was known for his ruthlessness. "Javier's here," Sarah muttered under her breath. The team fell into formation, with Rocky leading the way. The dog's keen instincts were the key to getting the jump on Ortega and his men. Sarah felt the adrenaline surge through her body as she followed closely behind Harris, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. They moved closer, the distance between them and the men narrowing with each passing second. Sarah could hear voices now, low and frantic. Ortega and his associates were talking, their words indistinct but urgent. "They're nervous," Sarah thought, her mind racing. "They know we're here. They're preparing for a fight." The moment they reached the back of the hangar, Harris motioned for the team to take their positions. With a quiet command, he signaled for Rocky to move in. The dog crouched low, his body a perfect image of stealth and power. The door of the hangar creaked as it opened slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of Ortega's silhouette through the crack. He was standing near the back of a large cargo truck, the shadows obscuring most of his figure. But there was no mistaking who he was. Rocky, sensing the tension, let out a quiet growl, signaling that they had made their move. Harris, with a nod, gave the order. "Go?" The team rushed forward. But before they could reach the entrance, the doors suddenly slammed shut, and gunfire erupted from inside the hangar. The sound of bullets piercing the air echoed through the night, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. "Take cover," Harris shouted. And everyone dove for the nearest cover, their weapons drawn. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she slid behind a nearby pile of crates. The K9s barked furiously, their handlers keeping them under control as the situation escalated. In the distance, Sarah saw the silhouette of a figure moving quickly toward the back of the hangar. But she couldn't tell who it was. The world seemed to slow as she scanned the scene. Ortega was inside. But where were the others? Were there more men? And what was in that truck? A cold sweat dripped down her forehead as she gripped her weapon, ready for whatever came next. The gunfire had barely subsided when Sarah's mind snapped into focus. Her body, reacting on instinct, was already calculating the next move. Her eyes flicked to her surroundings, assessing every inch of the area. She could hear the rapid, uneven breathing of her team as they huddled behind cover. The air smelled of gunpowder, and the once quiet desert was now a battleground. "Stay low. Stay sharp," Harris barked, his voice steady but urgent. He peered around the corner of the crates, scanning the hangar entrance. "We don't know how many there are. Keep your heads down. Rocky, move in." The command sent a ripple of tension through Sarah. Rocky, The German Shepherd was a symbol of trust and precision. Sarah had worked with him countless times. But this situation was different. This wasn't just about tracking a scent or chasing down a criminal. This was a life and death standoff with one of the most dangerous cartel groups in the region. The dog, with his unflinching focus, moved toward the hangar entrance. His nose twitched in the air, as though sensing the subtle nuances of the unfolding chaos. Every muscle in Rocky's body was coiled, ready for action. Sarah's heart beat in sync with the dog's movements. She couldn't help but feel a sense of connection. A bond forged through years of working side by side. But there was something else now. A gut-wrenching feeling that they weren't just dealing with Ortega and his men. There was something bigger at play. Control. This is Collins. We've encountered heavy resistance. We need backup, now. Possible military-grade weapons involved, Sarah said into her radio. Her voice calm but firm. The static buzzed before a voice responded. Copy that? Collins. Reinforcements are on the way. But it'll be a few minutes. Keep your head down. Sarah clenched her jaw. A few minutes. It felt like an eternity. Suddenly, there was movement from inside the hangar, quick, purposeful steps. A shadow darted across the narrow opening of the door. Rocky's ears perked up. And without hesitation, he charged forward. His body a blur of speed and power. The K-9 unit's precision training was on full display as Rocky was able to spot the enemy with unmatched accuracy. Sarah's pulse quickened as she moved behind him, trying to keep up. Hold your fire unless you're absolutely sure, she instructed the team. Her voice tight with focus. The last thing they needed was to open fire prematurely, and risk hitting the wrong target. The team's movement was coordinated, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Harris led the way, with Sarah right behind him. They moved through the shadows, using the crates and remnants of old vehicles as cover. The closer they got to the hangar, the more dangerous things became. It wasn't just the danger from Ortega's men. Sarah had a gnawing feeling that they weren't alone in the desert tonight. Something wasn't right. The way Ortega had moved, the quick, almost rehearsed manner, told her that this wasn't the first time he'd been in a standoff like this. The hangar loomed ahead, its weathered walls barely holding together. The door slightly ajar. But Sarah didn't approach it directly. She knew better. This wasn't a standard cartel operation. This was something more intricate. Something more dangerous. Rocky. Wait, Sarah whispered. And the dog immediately froze. His body taut with alertness. His nose was in the air. His body language telling Sarah everything she needed to know. Something wasn't right. He could smell it too. Harris signaled for the team to hold, motioning for everyone to take cover. Sarah. We need to figure out where Ortega is hiding, he muttered, his eyes never leaving the hangar. Agreed, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. But we can't rush this. We need to know what we're dealing with. The sounds of the hangar were growing louder now. The clatter of metal. The muffled voices of men arguing. And the occasional crackle of gunfire. But one sound stood out, a sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of a helicopter rotor cutting through the air. Her heart skipped a beat. Control. Do you copy? Sarah's voice was urgent now. There's a helicopter inbound. We've got bigger problems. The radio crackled again. But the response was delayed. The static buzzed, leaving Sarah with a sinking feeling in her stomach. If they were dealing with a helicopter, this operation was far more sophisticated than she'd imagined. This wasn't just a cartel drug run. This was a full-scale smuggling operation with military-level resources. The situation had escalated quickly. She had no time to waste. The team needed to act. And fast. "Rocky," she whispered. Her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "Find them." The dog, who had been standing perfectly still, now moved with purpose. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air. His body low to the ground, moving in sync with Sarah's commands. She followed closely behind, trying to stay low as they approached the hangar. The closer they got, the clearer it became. The door of the hangar wasn't just ajar, it was deliberately propped open. Someone was waiting for them. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate their movements. "Ambush," Sarah muttered under her breath. Just as they reached the door, a figure stepped out from behind the corner of the hangar. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette outlined against the faint light of the helicopter above. He raised a weapon, but before he could fire, Rocky lunged. The K9's jaws locked onto the man's arm, and he let out a sharp cry of pain, dropping his weapon to the ground. But it wasn't just the dog that took the man down. Sarah, with her gun raised, fired a quick, controlled shot that incapacitated the man instantly. She exhaled slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure crumpled to the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. The helicopter was getting closer, the whir of its blades growing louder. Sarah knew they didn't have much time. Ortega was still inside, and there was no telling what else was waiting for them. "Move in," Harris ordered, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "We can't let them escape." The team surged forward, weapons at the ready, as Rocky led the charge. They moved swiftly, but cautiously. As they entered the hangar, the stench of oil, rust, and metal filled the air as they navigated the maze of crates and cargo. But it wasn't the hangar that had Sarah's attention. It was the man standing in the corner, partially hidden in the shadows. Ortega. He was standing next to an old, battered truck, his hands raised in a show of surrender. But Sarah wasn't fooled. She knew better than to trust a cartel lieutenant, especially one as cunning as Ortega. His eyes darted around the room, and for a split second, Sarah saw the flicker of something dark in his gaze. And then, everything changed. The door of the hangar slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the lights went out. The air in the hangar suddenly felt thicker, as if the darkness itself had come alive, pressing in on every side. The door slamming shut reverberated through the walls, and the sound of the helicopter's rotors became deafening. The lights blinked out, leaving the team in an eerie blackness that seemed to swallow them whole. Sarah's pulse raced, her hand instinctively reaching for her flashlight as she struggled to adjust her eyes to the gloom. "Everyone, stay alert," Harris commanded, his voice cutting through the tension. His silhouette was barely visible in the dark, but Sarah could make out his form, crouched low, eyes scanning every corner. She quickly flicked on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the inky darkness like a blade. The hangar was vast, the shadows stretching far beyond what they could see. The truck Ortega had been standing beside was now completely obscured. But Sarah could feel it there, the threat of it. Lurking just beyond her reach. The smell of gasoline, metal, and something far more unsettling filled the air, causing her senses to go on high alert. She turned her head, trying to make sense of the situation. The helicopter was no longer overhead, its sound diminishing into the distance. But something else had taken its place, a low, rhythmic thumping. Not the helicopter's engines. It was too steady, too deliberate. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate slightly with each beat. And Sarah's instincts screamed that they weren't alone. Before she could act, a voice shattered the silence. "You think you're safe?" The voice was cold, almost amused, coming from the far end of the hangar. Sarah's flashlight flicked in that direction, landing on a man who stepped into view. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his voice was unmistakable. "Ortega. You're surrounded," he continued, his voice eerily calm. "And there's nothing you can do to stop what's coming." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She took a step forward, her grip tightening on her weapon. "Ortega," she said sharply, her voice echoing in the space. "We've already taken down your men. You're done? Surrender now. And maybe we'll make this easy on you." But Ortega only laughed. A cruel, mocking sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. "You think this is about me?" He stepped closer, the glow of her flashlight illuminating his cold, calculating eyes. "You think this is just some little smuggling operation? You're not even close to understanding what's going on here. You've stepped into something much bigger than you can handle." Sarah narrowed her eyes, trying to keep him talking. The more he talked, the more she could learn about his plan. But she knew better than to get distracted. The last thing she needed was to let her guard down. The faint thumping sound grew louder, and Sarah's mind began to race. What was that? What was in the hangar with them? Before she could react, the ground shook again. This time harder. The entire hangar seemed to tremble. And Sarah almost lost her balance as the vibrations intensified. A loud crash sounded from somewhere in the distance. And then, silence. "Get down," Harris shouted. But it was already too late. The lights above them flickered once more. And then, boom. An explosion rocked the hangar, sending Sarah crashing to the ground. The force of the blast knocked the wind from her lungs, and she gasped for air, her ears ringing from the deafening sound. The flashlight slipped from her hand, rolling away into the darkness. The heat from the explosion burned her skin, as the entire hangar seemed to shift and groan under the shockwave. Sarah fought to regain her bearings, her vision swimming as she pushed herself off the floor. The sharp scent of smoke and burning metal filled her nostrils, and the world around her was a blur of flashing lights and disorienting noise. "Sarah." Harris's voice cut through the chaos, urgent and panicked. She felt someone grab her arm, pulling her to her feet. Harris's face was etched with concern, his breath heavy. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she snapped, brushing off his grip and reaching for her weapon. She glanced around, trying to make sense of the chaos. The explosion had torn through part of the hangar, sending debris scattering across the floor. The truck was now in flames, its engine roaring as smoke billowed into the air. But there was no sign of Ortega. "Where is he?" Sarah demanded, her voice low and tense. Harris turned quickly, scanning the room. "We've lost visual. He's gone. Gone. Sarah repeated, disbelief flashing across her face. Ortega couldn't have disappeared that quickly. There was no way. The hangar was enormous. But it wasn't big enough to hide a man in plain sight. Do a sweep, Harris ordered. His voice grim. Check every corner. He's still in here. But as the team moved forward, Sarah's gut told her something was wrong. This wasn't just a smuggling operation gone awry. There was something much more insidious at play. And Ortega had just given them a glimpse of it. The thumping noise returned. Louder than before. Reverberating through the walls. Sarah's eyes snapped toward the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from deep inside the hangar, beyond the flames and smoke. She could barely make out the outline of a large object, partially obscured by debris. But it was too dark to see clearly. "Cover me," Sarah said. Her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. She started to move toward the source of the noise, her flashlight flicking over the darkened space. Her breath was shallow, her heart pounding. As she realized the noise wasn't coming from the helicopter, it was coming from something else. Something far more dangerous. The hangar stretched out before her like a labyrinth of steel and shadows. As she neared the mysterious object, her flashlight flicked over it, illuminating the outlines of large crates stacked high in the corner. The thumping sound was louder now, more distinct. Sarah's mind raced as she stepped forward, her eyes locking onto the object at the center of the crates. It was a large, metallic object, glinting in the dim light. It was roughly the size of a shipping container. But Sarah knew it wasn't a simple crate. It was too perfectly shaped, too deliberate. She slowly approached, her hands trembling as she reached for her radio. "Control. This is Collins," she said, her voice urgent. "We've found something big here. I think we're looking at something far worse than just a drug operation. I need immediate backup. And I need it now." The radio crackled back. But before she could hear the response, a cold, mechanical whirring sound filled the air. The metallic object in front of her started to move. Slowly at first, then faster, as if something inside it was coming to life. And then, the door of the container slid open. Sarah's blood ran cold. Inside the container were not crates of drugs or weapons, but something far more dangerous, rows of weapons, military-grade equipment, automated drones, and even armored vehicles. The cartel was no longer just smuggling drugs. They were preparing for war. The light from Sarah's flashlight trembled in her hand as she stared at the contents of the container. Her mind was racing, processing what she was seeing in a disjointed blur. The automated drones lined up in rows looked like something out of a high-tech military arsenal, weapons that had no business being here in the hands of criminals. Beside them were several crates labeled with military-grade markings that Sarah couldn't even begin to decipher. And nestled among them were armored vehicles designed for urban warfare. This was no ordinary smuggling operation. This was an entire network preparing for something much bigger. Something far more dangerous. Her eyes darted around the hangar, scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. There was no time to waste. Ortega was still out there. And they had to figure out exactly what this shipment was for, and how to stop it before it could leave. "Get down!" Harris's voice cracked through the air like a whip. Before Sarah could react, another explosion rocked the hangar. This one was closer, much closer, and the force sent her tumbling to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of her. The world spun in a haze of smoke and fire. For a moment, she couldn't hear anything but the ringing in her ears. The overwhelming noise of destruction. Through the haze, Sarah scrambled to her feet. Her mind racing? She had to keep her focus. This was far from over. Her flashlight beam cut through the dust and chaos, landing on Harris, who had already gotten to his feet. His face was grim. But there was no time for words. Move. Harris barked, already charging toward the opening of the hangar. Sarah followed, her legs pumping hard as she sprinted behind him. The sounds of gunfire echoed from somewhere deeper inside the hangar, punctuated by the distinct whirring of drones that were now activated, their engines powering up, sending a wave of panic through Sarah's chest. "We need to stop those drones before they take flight," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "Too late for that," Harris replied, his eyes narrowing as he led the team toward the far end of the hangar. "We need to neutralize Ortega. He's the key to this whole operation." Sarah glanced toward the container, the line of drones sitting ominously within it, their metal frames glinting in the dim light. She had no doubt that the drones were capable of wreaking havoc if they were unleashed. Military-grade drones, designed for precision strikes, could wipe out entire cities if they were put in the wrong hands. And right now, they were in the hands of someone who didn't hesitate to use them. As they approached the back of the hangar, another drone zipped past overhead, its whirring sound cutting through the tension in the air. Sarah ducked instinctively, the sharp sound of its propellers buzzing above her head. She could hear the crackle of gunfire as well, coming from the other side of the hangar. Ortega's men were moving quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. But they were about to be met with more resistance than they'd planned. "Rocky! Find him," Harris shouted, his voice calm but urgent. The German shepherd bounded forward, his nose to the ground, weaving through the shadows as the team followed behind. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as they closed the distance. She could feel the intensity of the moment in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't just a routine bust. This was a war waiting to happen. "Stay close, everyone," Sarah said, her voice tight. This could get messy. As they neared the source of the gunfire, the team spread out, moving with precision. Sarah's eyes flicked to the walls, to the crates, to the scattered debris on the ground. There was no telling where Ortega or his men were hiding. But she knew they couldn't keep this up forever. And then, the voice she had been waiting for came through the darkness. "Did you really think you could stop this?" Ortega's voice echoed, cold and mocking. "You have no idea what's coming next." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew he was close, but she couldn't pinpoint his exact location. It was as though he had vanished into the shadows, like a ghost. But Sarah wasn't fooled. Ortega was here, and he had to be stopped before his plans could unfold. "Ortega!" Sarah shouted, her voice steady despite the rising fear. "It's over? You've lost?" The voice laughed, the sound cruel and full of derision. "You don't even know what I'm capable of," he said. And the noise of movement began to grow louder. The rustling of equipment, the faint click of guns being readied, the scuff of boots on concrete. "Take cover," Harris yelled as the team spread out again, their weapons raised. The hangar lit up with the sound of gunfire. Bullets pinged off metal, ricochet off the walls. Sarah dove behind a large piece of industrial machinery, her heart racing as she aimed her weapon toward the corner where Ortega's men had positioned themselves. She could hear them moving. The quick, calculated steps of soldiers who knew how to fight. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw him. Ortega. He was standing near the control panel for the drones. His hand hovering over the button that would release them into the night. "No," Sarah shouted, pushing herself off the ground and sprinting toward him. But Ortega was already one step ahead. As soon as he saw her moving toward him, he grinned, his hand pressing the button. The drones began to hum, their engines revving to life. "Not today," Sarah muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowing with focus. She raised her weapon and fired. The bullet hit the control panel squarely, causing a series of sparks to fly from the device. Ortega cursed. But it was too late. The drones sputtered for a moment before they powered down, their lights flickering and then going completely dark. But Ortega wasn't finished yet. He turned to face Sarah, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you've won?" he spat. "This is just the beginning." Sarah didn't flinch. She knew the stakes were higher now than ever. She could hear the faint sound of another vehicle approaching from outside the hangar. The unmistakable hum of something large. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But it was a start. "Get him," Harris ordered. And the team rushed toward Ortega, their weapons raised. But before they could close the distance, the ground trembled again. The air seemed to hum with an intensity Sarah could feel in her bones. It wasn't the helicopters. It wasn't the drones. It was something far worse. Something bigger than Ortega. Bigger than the cartel. And then, from the shadows, they heard the unmistakable sound of an engine revving. The war had only just begun. The sound of the engine revving was unmistakable, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. It wasn't the drones whirring or the distant helicopter anymore. This was something heavier. Something much more powerful. The vibrations beneath her feet grew stronger. And for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "Everyone, take cover," Harris shouted, his voice strained but commanding. The team scattered, diving behind anything that could provide cover. Sarah barely had time to think as she ducked behind a large steel beam, her gun held tightly in her hands. She glanced over at Harris, whose face was set in a grim mask. "This isn't just Ortega's operation," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible over the increasing roar of the engine. "There's something much bigger going on here." Harris's eyes darkened. "I know. We're not just fighting a cartel. Whatever's coming at us now, it's bigger than anything we've faced." The sound of the engine grew louder, reverberating through the hangar with terrifying force. The ground beneath Sarah's boots seemed to tremble as the mystery vehicle drew closer. Her heart raced, her muscles tensed, and her mind reeled as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Ortega had known it would be bad, but he hadn't expected this. Then, like a black beast emerging from the shadows, a massive armored vehicle roared into view. Its headlights cut through the dark, blinding Sarah for a split second. The vehicle was monstrous, a heavily armored military-grade transport vehicle, far more advanced than anything the cartel should have access to. "Jesus," Sarah muttered, barely able to believe what she was seeing. The machine rolled forward with a deafening engine growl, its treaded wheels crushing debris beneath it. This was no ordinary transport. This was something designed to withstand a small army's worth of firepower. Ortega must have had outside help, Harris said through gritted teeth. His eyes narrowing as he sized up the vehicle. This isn't just smuggling. This is a full-scale military operation. The massive armored vehicle slowed, coming to a stop in front of the hangar's main entrance. A hatch on the top of the vehicle opened, and a figure stepped out. It was a man, tall, with military fatigues and a hard, unyielding expression. He had a scar running down his cheek, a mark that told Sarah this was no ordinary soldier. This was someone who had seen battle. Ortega's men, already regrouping after the previous fight, watched with wary eyes. Ortega himself was nowhere to be seen, but Sarah knew he was still lurking in the shadows, watching from somewhere. The real threat, however, was the man stepping out of the vehicle. The newcomer surveyed the area with a cold, calculating gaze. He scanned the hangar, his eyes pausing briefly on each of Sarah's team members. When they met Sarah's eyes, there was no recognition, only a silent promise of violence. He was a professional, the kind of man who had been trained to kill without hesitation. The man finally spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying an air of authority. "I assume you're the ones causing all the trouble." Harris stepped forward, his hand on his weapon, but his posture calm. "And you are?" he asked, his voice measured, though Sarah could hear the tension in it. The man smirked, a cruel and almost amused expression. "I'm Colonel Javier Reyes. And this," he gestured to the armored vehicle behind him, "is just the beginning. I'm afraid your little border patrol team isn't enough to stop what's coming." Sarah's mind whirred as she processed the name. Colonel Reyes? She had heard whispers in the past of a man with connections to a covert military network that supplied weapons to cartels, an unofficial, shadowy force operating outside the law. But hearing the name in person brought a different kind of weight to it. Reyes was dangerous. A tactician who specialized in precision strikes and using chaos to his advantage. "You're with them?" Sarah said, her voice steady but cutting through the air. "You've been supplying the cartels with military-grade weapons." Reyes's smile only deepened, as though he enjoyed the realization. "Not just supplying?" he corrected. "We're helping them take control of the future. This country. This world. It's changing. And we're here to make sure the right side wins." The words sent a cold shiver down Sarah's spine. This wasn't just about drugs anymore. This wasn't even about money or power. Reyes and his men had a bigger goal in mind. And they were willing to use every weapon at their disposal, even the lives of innocent people, to achieve it. A gunshot rang out suddenly, interrupting the tension. One of Ortega's men, perhaps frustrated by the standoff, took a shot at the colonel. But Reyes didn't flinch. He barely even moved. Instead, a second shot rang out, the sound of a silenced weapon. The man who had fired dropped to the ground, his body jerking as if struck by lightning. The team tensed, the sight of the execution making it clear that Reyes was not a man to be crossed. "You see?" Reyes said, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. "You're not just fighting criminals. You're fighting a revolution." Sarah felt her blood run cold as the weight of his words sank in. A revolution. What kind of revolution could a man like Reyes be talking about? What had he and the cartels actually planned? She glanced over at Harris, who met her gaze with a hard look. "Colonel Reyes?" "Your time is up," Harris said. His voice low, filled with determination. "We're not going to let you tear this country apart." Reyes's eyes flickered with something between amusement and disdain. "You don't get it, do you?" He chuckled, darkly. "This isn't just about taking control. It's about creating the chaos that will reshape everything. Your little border patrol. Your guns. Your drones, none of it matters in the grand scheme of things. You can fight all you want. But when the storm comes, you'll be powerless. This is only the beginning." His voice dropped, becoming colder, more menacing. "Your country is falling apart. And we will be the ones to rebuild it." Before anyone could react, Reyes turned sharply, signaling to his men. The armored vehicle's hatch closed, and the engine roared back to life, shaking the ground once more. "This is far from over," Reyes called over his shoulder. "And when we're ready, you'll wish you never came here." The vehicle reversed slowly, the massive treads crushing everything in their path. The dust in the hangar swirled as the convoy began to pull out, with Reyes's men falling in line, their eyes fixed on Sarah and her team. And then, just like that, they were gone. Sarah stood still, the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on her chest. The vehicle's departure left a palpable sense of dread hanging in the air. She had come here to stop a smuggling operation. But now she knew the truth: this was just the tip of the iceberg. Reyes's plan was much bigger than anything they had prepared for. Harris's voice broke the silence. "Get back to the command center. We need to regroup and figure out our next move. This fight has only just begun." Sarah nodded. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The quiet hum of their vehicles as they sped back to base was unsettling. The tension that had filled the air in the hangar now followed them like a shadow. A constant reminder of the magnitude of the operation they had stumbled into. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, her mind racing with everything she had just witnessed. She could still hear the roar of Reyes's armored vehicle in her head, the chill of his voice lingering in her ears. "This is just the beginning," he had said. His words haunted her. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. But the bigger picture remained frustratingly elusive. She knew Reyes was more than just a military contractor, he was a mastermind behind a much larger operation. The drone shipments, the armored vehicles, the covert military assets, none of it made sense unless there was a larger war at play. But a war against whom? And what was their end goal? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her radio crackling to life. She immediately reached for it, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Collins." Her supervisor's voice came through, calm but tinged with urgency. "We've just received intel from a high-level source. Reyes isn't working alone. He's part of a much larger network. And they've been operating in plain sight for years." Sarah's grip tightened on the radio. "What do you mean? Operating in plain sight?" "We're talking about a covert military force. Right? How could they go unnoticed for so long?" "We've been asking ourselves that same question," came the response. "The problem is that Reyes's organization has deep connections, powerful ones. There are high-level politicians, business tycoons, and even foreign intelligence agencies backing him. This is far from a simple cartel operation. It's much more sophisticated. And it's bigger than we realized." The weight of the revelation hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Reyes and his operation weren't just criminal, they were embedded in the very systems that held the country together. This wasn't just about drugs or weapons anymore. This was an insurgency, a network of power brokers working behind the scenes, pulling strings to create chaos for their own gain. "I'll brief the team when we get back," Sarah said. Her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But I think we need to rethink our approach. We can't take them down with traditional methods. They've planned for this? They've been planning for a long time." "You're right." Her supervisor agreed. "We're going to need a new strategy. Get back to base. And we'll start preparing. Keep your head on a swivel, Collins. We're all in this now." The radio clicked off. And Sarah's thoughts turned inward again. What had they missed? How had Reyes and his network managed to stay hidden for so long? The operation felt almost like a ticking time bomb, each moment bringing them closer to disaster. Back at the command center, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah and her team entered the briefing room, where the screens were already filled with intel from various sources. Harris, standing at the front of the room, was the first to speak. "All right. Listen up," Harris said, his voice sharp and commanding. "We've been hit with a curveball. Reyes isn't just a cartel figurehead. He's leading an insurgency, a covert operation that goes all the way to the top. Our mission is no longer just about taking down the cartel. We have to find out who else is involved. And we need to stop them before they can carry out their plans." Sarah's gaze shifted to the large map on the wall, dotted with pins and notes, tracking various points of interest. There were locations linked to Reyes's operation, each one more cryptic than the last. Her mind raced as she took in the new information. This wasn't just about stopping shipments anymore. They needed to uncover the full extent of the network and expose the people pulling the strings. The drones, the weapons, the armored vehicles, they're just the tools, Sarah said, her voice tight with realization. We need to find out what Reyes's endgame is. What does he want with all of this power? We're working on that, Harris replied, pacing the front of the room. But for now, our priority is disrupting their supply chain. They've been able to stay hidden for so long because they've been moving under the radar. We need to stop them from moving any more resources, or we risk them growing stronger. We've got eyes on a few key locations. Another team member spoke up, his fingers tapping on the keyboard to bring up the information on the screens. We've tracked some of the supply routes to a compound near the border. It's heavily fortified. Reyes's men are moving goods through there. And it's a high-priority target. If we hit it hard enough, we might be able to cripple their operation for good. The room fell silent as everyone processed the plan. The stakes had just been raised. They weren't just up against a drug cartel anymore. They were up against a well-organized insurgency. And their next move could be the tipping point. Sarah leaned forward, her mind sharp. We hit the compound. But we do it quietly. We can't afford to let Reyes know we're onto him yet. Agreed, Harris said, his gaze locking with hers. We move in fast, hit hard, and get out before anyone has a chance to retaliate. This is our best shot to stop them before they escalate any further. The team nodded in unison, the resolve in their eyes clear. This was no longer just a mission, it was a war. And they were about to take the first step in a battle that would change everything. The convoy rolled out under the cover of night. A fleet of armored vehicles and specialized equipment designed to make the mission as swift and precise as possible. Sarah was at the head of the convoy. Her mind focused but her senses heightened. The mission ahead felt almost too quiet. As though the calm before a storm had descended over them. As they neared the compound, the first thing Sarah noticed was the silence. The night air was thick, almost suffocating, and there was no movement coming from the compound. But that didn't reassure her. It only made her more suspicious. "Something's wrong," she muttered. Barely audible. Harris, who was sitting next to her, nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. They're too prepared. They know we're coming." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of a distant explosion echoed through the night. Her stomach dropped. "Ambush," she shouted. "Get down." The convoy was already under fire. The insurgents had set a trap. The world erupted in chaos. The deafening sound of the explosion was like a slap to the face, shaking the very air around Sarah. The vehicles in the convoy jerked violently as a blast hit nearby, sending a wave of heat and dust into the night. The screech of tires, the crunch of metal, and the sudden onslaught of gunfire filled the air like a cacophony of destruction. The convoy had driven straight into an ambush. "Get down," Harris shouted, his voice barely audible over the roaring engine and the rapid-fire bursts coming from the surrounding darkness. Sarah instinctively dove to the floor of the vehicle, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hand tightened around her weapon, her fingers slipping over the cold steel as she braced herself for what was coming next. The convoy had been moving too easily, too quietly. It had been too perfect, and now the enemy had turned the tables. The explosion had thrown them off course, leaving their convoy exposed and vulnerable. It was a trap, a meticulously planned strike. The enemy knew exactly where they would be and when. It was no coincidence that they were ambushed so swiftly. "Move! Move!" Harris barked as he scrambled to unbuckle his seatbelt, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to return fire. Get to cover." Sarah's heart raced as she opened the door of her vehicle, slamming it shut behind her. The blast had scattered debris across the road, turning the once calm desert into a war zone. She quickly assessed the situation, trying to process the chaos around her. She could see muzzle flashes in the distance, the staccato bursts of gunfire lighting up the night. The compound ahead was surrounded, the attackers strategically positioned, cutting off any chance of retreat. "We've been set up," Sarah muttered to herself, her stomach sinking. They hadn't just walked into a fight, they'd been led here. And it wasn't just Reyes's men who had planned it, it felt as if the enemy had been watching them for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah scanned the landscape, looking for cover. She could see a few scattered rocks and old wreckage nearby, but nothing solid enough to provide real protection. She signaled to her team to take cover. The urgency of her movements reflected in her body language. They needed to hold their ground and fight back long enough to regroup. A gunshot cracked through the air, narrowly missing her as she ducked behind a pile of rocks. Her breath was shallow, the cold night air mingling with the heat of her adrenaline. She could hear the sounds of her team returning fire, but she knew they were severely outnumbered. The enemy was well armed, well prepared, and coordinated. This wasn't a standard ambush. This was a well-executed operation designed to annihilate them. "Collins, where are you?" Harris's voice came through her earpiece. sharp with concern. I'm on the right flank. Behind cover. I need backup, Sarah shouted as she quickly adjusted her position, peering over the rocks to assess the enemy's location. Stay put. We're moving up, Harris responded. A burst of gunfire erupted from the darkness, striking the vehicle beside Sarah. The explosion that followed sent her sprawling to the ground, the force of the blast knocking the air from her lungs. The pain was instantaneous, and for a moment, she was dazed, her vision spinning as dust and debris swirled around her. But there was no time to recover. Through the haze, she saw Harris sprinting toward her, his weapon raised, providing cover fire as he maneuvered through the chaos. Sarah, get up, he yelled, his voice cutting through the din of battle. We need to move now. She struggled to her feet, her legs shaky from the blast. But the adrenaline kicked in, sharpening her focus. She didn't have time to think about the pain. They had to get to safety, or better yet, strike back. As they advanced toward the compound, the sound of another explosion rang out, this one closer than the last. The ground trembled under their feet, and Sarah barely managed to stay on her feet. The ambush wasn't over, it was escalating, and they were being pushed back with every passing second. Where are they getting all this firepower? Sarah muttered under her breath as she moved cautiously forward, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The enemy's movements were precise, and their weapons were sophisticated. This wasn't just a fight against men with guns. This was a well-organized operation, backed by resources they hadn't accounted for. The sounds of battle were deafening. But amidst the chaos, Sarah could hear a voice through the radio, distant and distorted by static. It was a voice she didn't recognize. Team Alpha, do you copy? The voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down her spine. This is not your fight. Sarah froze, her hand tightening on the radio, a knot forming in her stomach. Who is this? She demanded, her voice barely controlled. Who's speaking? The voice paused for a moment, almost as if savoring the tension. Then it spoke again, its tone flat and emotionless. You've been set up. This mission was never about stopping the cartel. It was about silencing you. We know everything about your operation. Sarah, you're expendable. Her breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as the realization sank in. It wasn't just the cartel that was trying to eliminate them, it was someone within their own ranks. Someone who had been feeding the enemy information from the inside. A traitor? Who is this? Sarah demanded again, her voice low with fury. Show yourself. The voice on the radio chuckled softly. A cold, chilling sound that sent a wave of dread washing over her. You'll find out soon enough, the voice replied. But by the time you do, it will be too late. Enjoy the fight while you can. And then, the radio went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Move. Move. Move, Harris shouted, snapping Sarah out of her trance. She snapped her head back to the present, realizing just how exposed they were. But the words on the radio had settled into her mind. They had been betrayed. Someone on the inside was working against them. And that person had led them straight into the heart of the enemy's trap. The realization hit her hard. Who could it be? Who could have sold them out? Was it someone in their team? Someone high up? There was no time for answers right now. The enemy was closing in. And they needed to keep moving. Form up. Harris barked as he led the team forward, trying to break through the enemy's lines. We're going to make our way to the compound and take it back. No one gets left behind. But as Sarah advanced, her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the true battle was only just beginning. The ambush. The betrayal. The traitor, all of it was connected. And the deeper they got into this war, the more she realized just how far the conspiracy ran. The dust from the explosions still hung thick in the air, clinging to Sarah's skin like the residue of a nightmare. Every breath she took felt like inhaling fire. Each step forward was weighed down by the oppressive realization that they had been played. The voices on the radio, the distant sound of gunfire, and the smell of burning metal created a surreal atmosphere where nothing made sense anymore. As Sarah and the team pushed forward, Harris's voice cut through the haze. Stay tight. We need to get to that compound and figure out what's going on. The longer we're out here, the worse it's going to get. Every inch they moved toward the compound felt like an eternity. The tactical training kicked in. But it didn't dull the uncertainty that gnawed at Sarah. Who could have sold them out? How long had this betrayal been festering under the surface? The voice on the radio, so calm, so sure of itself, lingered in her thoughts. A constant reminder that there was a far bigger game being played. And they were right in the middle of it. The compound loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the orange glow of the fires that raged in the distance. The area was heavily fortified, with tall fences, watchtowers, and armed guards posted at regular intervals. But none of that intimidated Sarah. She had seen worse. What worried her was what lay inside the compound, what Reyes and his forces were preparing to unleash. Rocky. Track, Sarah whispered to the K9. As the German shepherd by her side began sniffing the ground, his body tense with focus. The dog had been with Sarah through countless operations, and she trusted him implicitly. His training, his instincts, they were the team's greatest asset. The wind howled through the night, carrying the faint echo of approaching footsteps. Sarah motioned to the team, signaling them to move quickly. They needed to get closer to the compound undetected. As they neared the outer fence, the faint sound of muffled voices drifted through the air. "They're talking," Harris whispered, his voice tight. "Someone's out there." Sarah raised her hand to signal a stop. She scanned the area ahead, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the faint movement of shadows on the opposite side of the fence. Through the small gaps in the chain link, she could make out the figures of two armed guards, talking in low voices. "I'll take the left. You take the right," Sarah said quietly, turning to Harris. "We can't let them know we're here." The team nodded in agreement, spreading out and moving silently as they closed in on the guards. Sarah's heart beat in sync with her footfalls as she crouched low to the ground, moving like a shadow through the darkness. The only sounds were the faint whispers of the wind and the quiet crunch of dirt beneath their boots. In a swift motion, Sarah jumped to her feet, her weapon raised as she knocked the first guard unconscious, her fist landing a well-timed blow to his head. Harris quickly followed suit, disarming the second guard and securing him. Within seconds, both men were subdued and lying motionless on the ground. Sarah and Harris exchanged a glance. There was no time for questioning them, they needed to move deeper into the compound. "Let's go," Harris muttered. His eyes focused ahead. "We've got no idea how many more are inside." They advanced toward the main entrance of the compound, creeping through the shadows. The sound of gunfire growing faint in the distance as the battle outside began to die down. The walls of the compound were solid, designed to withstand both time and force. But that didn't matter. What mattered was what lay beyond, the heart of Reyes's operation. The core of the insurgency that had infiltrated their ranks. The main building came into view. A stark, industrial structure. Sarah's eyes narrowed. This was it? She could feel the pulse of the place, the weight of its purpose. This was where it all came together. If they could break in and take control of this facility, they would have Reyes by the throat. But as they moved closer, Sarah could feel something off in the air. A disturbance. Something wasn't right. The doors of the compound creaked open, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway. The faint hum of machinery could be heard from within. And as Sarah motioned for the team to enter, her mind raced. What kind of operation were they walking into? And who had been feeding the enemy information? They moved swiftly through the hallway, their boots echoing against the metal floors. There were no guards here, no immediate threats. But Sarah felt the unease growing in the pit of her stomach. They were being watched. She could feel it, a cold presence. Like something was lurking just beyond their reach, waiting for them to make a mistake. At the end of the hallway, they found a heavy steel door, locked but not impassable. Harris quickly set to work on the lock, his hands moving with practiced speed and precision. Seconds felt like hours as the lock clicked open, and the door swung inward with a low groan. What they saw inside took Sarah's breath away. The room was massive, a hangar-like space filled with rows of high-tech military equipment. There were drones of varying sizes, armored vehicles, stacks of crates labeled with foreign military insignia, and several large machines Sarah couldn't immediately identify. The walls were lined with monitors, all showing different images from around the compound and beyond. But it wasn't the equipment that made Sarah's heart race. It was the man standing at the far end of the room, facing away from them, his back to the monitors, hands clasped behind him. Ortega. He had been waiting for them. Sarah's gut twisted with fury. The moment of realization hit her like a wave. Ortega hadn't just been a pawn in Reyes's operation. He was the one orchestrating it, the true mastermind behind the insurgency. "Welcome to the end of the line," Ortega said, his voice cold and mocking as he slowly turned to face them. The expression on his face was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the satisfaction in his eyes. He had anticipated their every move. And now, standing in the heart of his operation, they were trapped. "You thought you were fighting the cartel," Ortega continued, his voice calm, almost reassuring. "But the real enemy is much closer than you think." Sarah's pulse quickened. She had been right. This wasn't just a drug operation. It was a full-scale insurgency. And Ortega had been pulling the strings all along. He had fed Reyes his military resources, used the cartel as a cover, and infiltrated their ranks. The betrayal ran deeper than anyone had imagined. "But you're too late," Ortega said with a smirk. "You've already walked into my trap." Before Sarah could react, the room was filled with the hum of drones powering up, the lights on their metallic bodies flashing as they came to life. The machines buzzed, their engines roaring in the silence. "Get down," Harris shouted, pulling Sarah behind cover. But it was already too late. The drones locked onto their targets. Their weapons primed. And the battle for their lives began. The hum of the drones was deafening. Like a swarm of angry wasps descending on their prey. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she ducked behind the massive steel crate. The whirring of the machines growing louder by the second. She could feel the pulse of the room, the heat. The anticipation. And the pressure. Ortega's mocking voice echoed in her mind as he stood there. Confident? Watching them struggle. You've walked right into my trap. Ortega's voice cut through the chaos. Do you really think you can stop me now? The words were meant to demoralize them. But Sarah's mind was already racing. The drones were armed with enough firepower to decimate everything in the compound. And they were locked on her team. If they didn't act fast, they'd be dead in minutes. We need to disable them, Sarah shouted. Her voice sharp. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Harris. The control panel, find it. On it. Harris called back. His voice tight with urgency. Cover me. The team moved swiftly. Ducking behind crates and machinery as the drones circled. Their red lights flashing ominously. The faint beeping of their targeting systems filled the air. A reminder of how close they were to being hit. Every step they took felt like it could be their last. Sarah's mind was working overtime. Calculating their next move. There had to be a way to stop the drones, but where was the control panel? It had to be nearby. The entire room was a labyrinth of equipment. And every corner could be hiding an ambush. She glanced over at Harris, who was moving toward a row of monitors. His eyes scanning the display. Got it, he shouted after a few tense moments. There's a control room on the upper floor. I can override the systems. But we need to get there before those drones lock onto us. Move. Sarah barked. Leading the charge toward the stairs that led to the upper level. They had no time to waste. The drones were closing in. Their weapons now primed for launch. As they moved toward the stairs, the first drone fired. A burst of red light sliced through the air. And Sarah barely managed to dive to the side as the blast hit a crate behind her, sending a shockwave through the room. The explosion sent shards of metal flying, narrowly missing her. Stay low, Harris shouted, returning fire with his rifle. The sound of bullets hitting the metal hull of the drones rang in the air, but it did little to stop them. They were too well armored. Too well designed. We're running out of time, Sarah hissed. Her heart pounding. They needed to make it to the control room, and fast. Harris was already ahead. Moving with practiced precision as he ran up the metal steps toward the control room. Sarah followed closely. Her weapon raised. Scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The drones continued to circle above. But she knew they couldn't afford to be distracted. If they didn't take out the control system, the drones would wipe them out. As they reached the top of the stairs, Sarah saw the control room, a glass-walled compartment that overlooked the main floor. Inside, a row of computers and terminals blinked with activity. But there was no time to marvel at the technology. They needed to shut down the drones. Harris smashed the glass with a single brutal strike, his hand reaching in to access the terminal. Give me a second, he muttered, fingers flying over the keys. Behind them, the sound of drones shifting in the air grew louder. The countdown was ticking down. We've got seconds. Harris. Sarah called out. her eyes darting toward the monitors. They were tracking them now? One wrong move, and they'd all be dead. The first drone was almost upon them. Its targeting system locked in. It fired. The blast shook the control room, rattling the windows. But Harris didn't flinch. He was in the zone. His mind working faster than the seconds on the clock. And then, with a final tap of his finger, the control system blinked, the drones halted, hovering in midair, their engines sputtering to a stop. "Done," Harris shouted, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. For a split second, everything stood still. The drones hung motionless in the air, their weapons disarmed, their lights dimming. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her heart still racing from the near miss. They had done it. The immediate danger had passed. But the fight wasn't over. "Get back to the main floor," Sarah yelled, already turning toward the stairs. They needed to make their move. Ortega was still here. And he wouldn't stop, not now. "We need to find him." The team moved quickly, retracing their steps back to the lower floor, where the remnants of the battle raged on. The sounds of gunfire had slowed. But Sarah knew that didn't mean victory. Ortega was still out there, and he wasn't going down without a fight. The room was eerily quiet now. The only sounds were their footsteps and the faint hum of the remaining machines. As they rounded the corner into the main room, Sarah's eyes locked onto Ortega. He was standing by a large table, his back to them, speaking into a communication device. "Now," Sarah shouted. The team surged forward, weapons raised. And Ortega turned just as the first shots rang out. His eyes were wide, but his expression was one of calm defiance, not fear. He had expected them to come for him, but Sarah could see the hesitation in his movements. He was calculating his next move, and he was dangerous. "Did you really think you could stop me?" Ortega said, his voice cool, his hands raising slowly, as if surrendering. "You were never supposed to win. You were pawns in a game you'll never understand." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. He knew what was coming. But Sarah wasn't about to let him control the narrative. She raised her weapon. "Enough," Sarah said, her voice low and commanding. "This ends now?" Ortega's eyes flicked toward the door. But Sarah knew he was trapped. The drones had been disabled, his men scattered, and the compound was in chaos. There was nowhere for him to run. But before she could make her move, the air was filled with the sound of something far more ominous. The doors to the compound slammed shut, sealing them in. The flickering lights above them died out, plunging the room into darkness. The eerie hum of machinery returned, louder now, almost as if it were breathing. And then, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The tremors weren't just from the blast anymore, this was something else. "Stay alert," Harris shouted, his eyes scanning the room, looking for any signs of the next threat. "We're not alone." The darkness swallowed them whole. And Sarah realized with a sickening feeling that they hadn't just walked into a trap. They had walked into a storm. The shaking of the ground intensified, the vibrations deepening, as if the very foundations of the compound were coming alive. The faint hum of machinery grew louder, now accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping that reverberated through the walls. It was a sound unlike anything Sarah had heard before, mechanical. Alive. Ominous. Move, Harris shouted, his voice rising above the unsettling noise. Get to cover. Now. The entire team dove for cover behind whatever they could find, crates. Machines? Anything that could shield them from the unknown threat that was closing in. The silence that followed was deafening. Each second stretched out, thick with tension. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind a large generator, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind raced, searching for answers, trying to make sense of what was happening. The compound had been quiet for a brief moment, but the low rumble of the ground, the mechanical hum, the sudden darkness, it was all a sign of something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. Check the monitors, Sarah ordered. Her voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. She looked toward the now dim control room, the flashing screens within still offering a glimpse of the madness unfolding outside. We need eyes on what's happening. What's causing all this? Harris nodded, moving swiftly toward the control room. Sarah's eyes stayed trained on Ortega, who hadn't moved since they had entered the room. He stood there, as calm as ever, the slight smirk on his face only deepening with each passing second. There was no panic in his eyes, no fear, just an unsettling, unnerving sense of control. You think you've won? Ortega sneered. This is just the beginning. You've walked into the heart of it. This compound. It's just a decoy. A distraction. Sarah's grip tightened on her weapon. What are you talking about? Look around you, Ortega said, gesturing at the large machines and the dormant drones. These are only the tools. The real weapon is what's coming now. Before Sarah could respond, Harris's voice crackled through her earpiece. Sarah, you need to see this. It's not over. There's a secondary system we didn't know about. They're powering up something in the lower levels. The words hit her like a punch. Secondary system. Lower levels. That was the heart of the operation. If Ortega's men had been hiding something deeper, something worse than the drones and weapons they'd already seen, they had no time to waste. We need to go. Now. Sarah barked, already pushing herself to her feet and moving toward Harris. The others followed close behind, the urgency in their movements matching the panic that was starting to rise in her chest. They ran down the corridor toward the staircase that led to the lower levels, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The ground still trembled beneath them, and the rhythmic thumping sound had grown louder, more intense, as though something large was moving within the bowels of the compound. I knew you wouldn't just give up, Ortega called out behind them, his voice low, taunting. It's too late. You're already too deep. Sarah didn't turn back. She couldn't afford to waste time listening to his twisted words. They had to stop whatever he had planned before it was too late. As they descended into the lower levels, the atmosphere became even more suffocating. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. The lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows on the walls, making the space feel like a maze. Sarah's flashlight beam bounced off the concrete walls, illuminating the stark, cold reality of the situation. The lower levels were a labyrinth of industrial equipment, tanks, and crates, a stark contrast to the polished control room above. Where is it? Sarah demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. There. Harris pointed ahead, his flashlight illuminating a massive steel door at the end of the corridor. "That's where it's coming from." The thumping was louder now, reverberating through the concrete floor, shaking the walls. The door was sealed shut, reinforced with heavy locks. But it was obvious that whatever was inside was preparing to move. "We don't have much time," Sarah said, already moving toward the door. "Get it open." The team worked quickly, Harris pulling out the breaching tools as the rest of the team covered him. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the door, her body tense, as she waited for the moment they'd finally get a glimpse of what lay behind it. Seconds felt like hours. But finally, the heavy door creaked open with a long, groaning sound. Inside, Sarah's eyes widened as the dim light from their flashlights revealed the full scope of the operation. A massive, robotic machine stood in the center of the room. It was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen before. Its towering, armored frame was adorned with military-grade weaponry, its glowing red eyes flickering to life as the systems powered up.